My great-great-grandfather, John Bradley Sitton, and his young sister walked from Pickinsville area to Pendleton carrying all their possessions to live with an aunt and uncle in Pendleton. And I don't know why they came, okay. This was around 1827, and John Bradley was about 20, and his sister could have been about 16 or 17, okay. So he learns a trade, he made carriages, he built carriages and so forth and so on, and was the mayor of Pendleton for about 20 years. He built the first brick house in Pendleton in 1859, which is right off the square, and it's called the Sitton House. And if you look at the Sitton House in the street, you'll see it's got a side porch right on the front of the house as you face the house. And when that house was built, he was also the postmaster, and the post office was in that house, his house, and people would come in from the side door to go into the post office. The war between the states came. He was the receiver for the Confederacy in the upper part of the state. In other words, he took, I guess, funds in to turn over to whatever. So on the Smith side, James Dawson Smith the first, I am the fourth, and because we were blessed with $5, I'll be the last. The good Lord decided it was enough James D. Smiths in Pendleton because I'm the fourth, okay.
Fourth and last.
Fourth and last, that's right, Alpha and Omega, okay. So anyway, my great-grandfather, James Dawson Smith the first, was a merchant somewhere in the Greenville area. He married a woman named Bates, who might have been like Batesville over there. So he came to Pendleton, so the story goes, in maybe in the early 1860s, to get into a larger town. Hurley Batters told me years ago that on the square in Pendleton in the 1820s, that 30 or 40 attorneys from around the upper state practiced out of that courthouse. And this was before the county was broken down into Pickens and Oconee and Greenville, and it was all split up. So Pendleton was a thriving town back in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. James Dawson Smith II was a dairy farmer, and then he wanted to get into the oil business around 1920. So he and two guys bought the little piece of land right there on the square where this station is now. A guy named Jones and one was Heron, I believe, but he bought them out after about 1 or 2 years and had a little gas station there. And then 1923 or 24, he became a distributor, so to speak, for Standard Oil Company. Him, my father, and I through to 2001, so about 80 years there.
Wow.
So we had a service station there, and my dad built this new building that's there now in 1950. And we were wholesalers, and we also had a service station, but our offices were in the back of the service station where it was big enough to take care of that. So about 10% of our business, well, maybe over the years, was like the service station, but about 90% was the wholesale part, where we sold fuel oil and had about 10 gas stations. We delivered gas to wholesale and so forth.
What was your experience that first year at the Citadel? We hear horror stories.
If you read Pat Conroy's book, that's highly overrated because if it had been that bad when I was there, I'd have never made it. It was interesting. It was a lot of fun back in those days. We were more restrained, I guess, than they are now, perhaps, And I don't know, the academics may be tougher today than they were then, but maybe the other part might have been a little worse then. Every generation thinks their generation down there had it the worst, the tougher. We had been there about 6 weeks. General Clark had just taken over about a year earlier, and they were trying to fill up the barracks. The barracks, the population had sort of decreased over the years. So they took in some cadets, some guys who maybe weren't qualified physically to go. They just took them in. They had to apply. So we had started off with about 830 guys, I think, and after about 6 weeks, I'm not sure the number, maybe 150 had quit. This in the first 6 or 8 weeks. They said we stopping the plebe system. No more harassment. You can't chew out the freshmen. You can't do anything. Okay. So some of the guys, the freshmen, will walk around for that one day outside the room with cigars in their mouth, trying to, okay. But anyway, we knew it would not last. So the second morning, I guess it was, after breakfast, all the freshmen, the plebes, went over behind Bond Hall and had a protest that we want the plebe system back. There are some pictures in the yearbooks that show this to be true. And lo and behold, they put it back in. And then, of course, it hit the fan then,
Yeah.
But that was one of the interesting stories of my freshman year. I worked with my dad for 4 or 5 months after I graduated, which I didn't go on active duty until November. As I graduated on June 6, 1959, which was 15 years to the date of the Normandy invasion.
How about that?
Okay, and the speaker of the graduation was 4-star General Maxwell Taylor, who I believe was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, I believe the highest ranking officer that parachuted into the Normandy invasion. And that was, so I always think of that as such a special day.
Was there ever any doubt that you would move back to Anderson County and to Pendleton?
I don't think so. I love Pendleton. I'm born here because of that, but I love the small town atmosphere, and enjoy working with my dad all those years. And because we knew we were going to be here, we were able to say build this house in 1966. It was very early on. We couldn't have built this house if I had just worked for some other company in some other town. So they said that was a benefit.
But your dad established this community.
The subdivision.
Right.
That's correct.
And so you got this house, and we might tell people that you're right next to Tri-County Tech.
Yeah.
Since building that house and moving back from the Citadel, how has Pendleton changed over the years? Very much? It's
really changed in the last few years. The expansion from the city limits down on the way to Anderson, you know what that is. Yep. And an interesting little story to that is, you know where the Quick Trip is.
Yeah, the new Quick Trip, yeah.
On this side of the Quick Trip, there's a little small lot there. It's grass there. Okay, so we bought that little lot about 60 years ago. I've owned it. Okay. So that lot has never been, that property has never been in the town limits, okay? All right, but the property next to it toward Pendleton has been in the town limits. So 6 or 8 years ago, when Quick Trip wanted to come to Pendleton, which was a big deal for Pendleton,
huge.
And the town followed us, they loved the idea of getting all that revenue, so okay. But Quick Trip wanted to be in town, and they wanted sewage. They had to have sewage, okay? So the town was, our little lot had landlocked the town's progress. So we surveyed 2/10 of a little piece of spot on the backside of our lot, okay? And that's how the town came to Quick Trip, Bojangles, and you know what's happened all down the road toward the Bosque Bell. All that has come. If you look at the zoning map right now closely, you'll see that one little strip there, because you can't jump over in zoning. You just can't jump over property.
Right.
So that's how all this other stuff ended up happening.
Which is kind of unique.
Yeah,
I mean, you got bragging rights. You can go stand up there and hold a sign and says, "I'm in the middle of Anderson County."
Yeah, that's correct.
Even though you got the city on both sides of you.
That's correct. During the war, World War II, I was probably 6 or 7 or 8 years old. Used to be occasionally they had blackouts, and the siren would go off, and you had to turn your lights off. That's what I think I remember. A couple of times there were military convoys that actually came through Pendleton. There was no 4-lane highway. They had to come right through, and I never knew where they went to or where they were going. And then one time, I think on VE Day or VJ Day, the school was 2 blocks away from the square. The school all marched uptown. I remember that. All these men came back from the World War II that lived in the Pendleton, Sandy Springs, LaFrance, Clemson area. Okay. There weren't jobs for all these people. All of a sudden, we didn't have the industry now. So some merchants from Pendleton on the square, including my dad, came up with an idea to buy a big tract of land, to raise the money, buy a large tract of land, have it paid for, then offer it to Roger Milliken to build a plant on. It starts right around the square in Pendleton. You can go, I can tell you all these merchants there. Later on, they were still there when I grew up, okay. And then they worked on this, and then they got other people. There were merchants from Anderson, like McDougal, okay. I think probably Judson Minyard, Sullivan Motors, the Anderson Independent chipped in a few $1,000s, and the county chipped in a few $1,000s. So anyway, so they came up with a total here of about $38,000. This was in 1947 and 48. Okay, they bought the land, and the land where the Milliken plant is now and all this development was called the Dalton Farm. The Daltons owned that. It was about 230, 40 acres. My understanding from my dad was they contacted Charlie Daniel, I believe,
Yep.
to contact Roger Milliken to see if he would be interested in building a plant in Pendleton. Okay, so that happened, and Milliken said, I've heard over the years that he said, if a town wants, this is 1948, I guess by now, wants me to build a plant there bad enough and wants to give us the land, I think we ought to do it. So supposedly Mr. Milliken told somebody that he took the equivalent amount of money and made a donation to some charity. That's just hearsay. I don't know about it, and I wouldn't doubt that happened. So they built the plant. That's how Garris Milliken Mill was built.
Have you heard of any other town doing that?
No, I have not. I have not.
Yeah.
And this goes to show what I'd like to tell, story I'd like to tell about the greatest generation, about my father's generation and your parents' generation, about things that citizens did over a period of about 25 years to improve the town. It wasn't just of course the town fathers were involved a little bit, but it was the citizens that drove all these projects.
Right.
In 1951, the telephone service was very poor in Pendleton. So a group of the merchants in town, the business people in town, decided they wanted to write Southern Bell and complain to see if they could get a new exchange building built there, and there's the petition. Some of the same people that signed these others. Okay, and this worked.
And it worked.
They got it. Okay. The other situation here was when the 4-lane highway was coming through from Anderson to Clemson in about 1960 or something, but early on. Okay, so they drew up plans, and the 4-lane highway was going to come toward Pendleton and cut behind where the Milliken Mill is, go back through the country and come back in up here somewhere around Old Stone Church. I'm not sure where.
So they had gone through Fance Grove.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Okay, well, the merchants in town, these same people, knew that was not good for the town, right? So they petitioned, that's my dad's name, first one on the list, petitioned the highway department, Mr. Silas Pierman and that group, that would destroy Pendleton and to please reconsider and redo it. Okay, so that happened. So that's the reason the 4-lane highway is just on the outskirts of Pendleton. At that time, the post office was where the Farmers Hall is. In 1960, Pendleton had no home delivery to the mail. You couldn't get mail at your house. Okay, so there was a committee that was started to Congress. This is a letter here to my dad from Congressman Brian Dorn.
Yep.
And so that took a year or two to do it, and then they had to get the Exchange Club in Pendleton, I think, as I remember. They're the ones that took around and they were the ones that volunteered. They went around and they put the numbers on the houses. So finally, and Pendleton had enough people, and also finally that's how we got
home delivery.
That pretty well ended up my dad's activity. He died in '86, but one little quick story. Before he died in '86, he was somewhere in the Highlands, North Carolina, and met some young man that worked for the state of South Carolina. And he got to talking to this guy, and this young man told him about that there were grants available for cities and towns around the state. So my dad came back and he got the information and gave it to Philip England, who was the first town administrator for Pendleton, Phil England, and the town applied for this grant, and they got, I think, here's a copy of one of the checks from the state. They got, I think, two like $37,000 checks, and that's what paid for it, installing these gas lights around the square there. This, I guess, are still there.
How about
and that was just citizen passing on something.
Yeah. The Pendleton area traditionally has appreciated their historical buildings, but that appreciation had to begin with something. How did that start? Okay, from my recollection, it began probably in the early 1960s. There were two men at Clemson University, Dr. James Miles, who was, I think, a horticulture professor, and David Watson, who might have been in charge of the physical plant for Clemson College. Okay, they are the two who started this movement for Pendleton. Okay, so they started inquiring and asking about these homes, and like Woodburn and Ashtabula, and all of a sudden, my dad said he realized that here
people were trying to do things to help preserve our town, and nobody in our town would seem to be interested. So my dad said, it's sort of like, as for default, he decided he would try to get involved and help them some, because he was a citizen of Pendleton, a merchant, and it was just a good thing. And also about the same time, Jerry Sloan Sr. he and my dad were first cousins, I think, or second cousins, but Jerry Sloan Sr. got involved too. So
he was the mayor.
He was the mayor somewhere in there at a point in time. More people from Pendleton gradually got involved, but it was David Watson and Jim Miles who were the two people that got this thing going in Pendleton. But I remember Dr. Miles came in one time, Jim Miles. He says, I'm going to get Clemson College to give the Historical Society Woodburn. And so Clemson College gave the foundation Woodburn. And of course, there's been a lot of money spent there, and they've done a good job. Eventually ended up owning Ashton Butte right here on Highway 88. And then later on, after this thing really got moving good, then you had an individual lady who basically was, I don't know if it was the docent or in charge, just like here at Woodburn, Lib Meehan, Jerry and John Meehan's mother. She was in charge of that for years and years, and she took care of that just like it was her home. Yeah. And then Mrs. Shackelford took care of Ashton Butte just like it was her home. They go out there about every day and pick up sticks and everything. But those two ladies were very important. Well, I just want to give a shout out to all these people from 1947 to about 1965 that did all these things to make these things happen for Pendleton.
And as a result, Pendleton is now the jewel of Anderson County.
Well, we might be a little prejudiced on that.